Hello, everyone. This is Empowering Democracy, and I'm your host, Joe Firestone. And the topic for this stream is called Ending the ISDS System. What does ISDS stand for? It stands for Interstate Dispute Settlement System, and the clauses within very many of our trade treaties. There are clauses in most of them containing the language to allow the application of the interstate dispute settlement system. So, let's take a look. Hi, Steve Wolfbrand, and hi, Kay. How you doing? Okay, let's take a look at a recent article. Well, before I take you to the recent article, let's look at, or let's note that I wrote a book on this subject. The book is called Declarations of Dependence, Trade, Tyranny, Sovereignty, and Democracy. And this book was mainly a critique of the attempts by the Obama administration to conclude trade treaties in 2015 and 2016 that would contain the investor state dispute settlement system. In other words, that incorporated that system within these trade treaties. They were the Trans Pacific Partnership, the TPP. There was also the TTIP, which was the transatlantic, what the hell was it called again exactly? Anyway, there was a transatlantic version of the TPP, and there was also one called the TPP, the TPIP, and what was the last one? Anyway, the last one was concerned with intellectual property, and it allowed for this interstate dispute settlement thing to apply to trade and business in the area of intellectual property as well. So a little later, I'm going to read you a passage from my book about the dangers of the ISDS system. But right now, we're going to go to a recent article that appeared in Common Dreams. I'll share that with you, and we'll get into some of the details. Okay. So this piece is called Neoliberal Investor State System is a Threat to Democracy and the Planet. That was the conclusion of my book also, by the way. This was by Manuel Perez Rocha on November 15th, 2022, and was originally published at inequality.org. In advance of the global climate negotiations taking place in Egypt, several countries announced important actions to curb the power of the fossil fuel industry. For decades now, a global web of international investment agreements has given corporations excessive power to block government policies they don't like through, quote, investor-state dispute settlement mechanisms. These agreements grant corporations the right to sue governments in unaccountable supranational tribunals, demanding huge payouts in retaliation for actions that might reduce the value of their investments. The wording of these things speaks of the potential profits they might lose, and what they're trying to do by going to the tribunals is getting judgments regarding the potential profits that they might lose because the government did something. Now, they're not even a fact that if they've lost those profits, awards are being made on the basis of calculations of potential profits. Corporations are able to file such lawsuits over a wide array of government actions, including actions designed to protect people and the planet. Poland, Italy, France, the Netherlands, and Spain have now announced they will withdraw from one of these anti-democratic agreements, the Energy Charter Treaty, a 1991 pact signed by about 50 countries. The ECT offers special protections to oil, gas, and mining corporations and energy companies, undermining governments' abilities to address climate change. These countries' rejection of the Energy Charter Treaty is welcome, but much more needs to be done. The United States is not a member of the ECT, but the U.S. government has been a major driver of the investor-state system, insisting on including such corporate powers in dozens of trade agreements and bilateral investment treaties, and only partially ruling some of these back in recent years. By the way, this kind of thing was started way back in the Nixon administration. And then we went crazy creating trade treaties like that during the 1980s as the neoliberals gained hold of our national politics. And by the way, the efforts to conclude these trade treaties, they were bipartisan, both Republican and Democratic. The neoliberal regime spans the two parties. It is what has created the uniparty system here in the United States. Altogether, the nearly 3,000, going back to the article, altogether the nearly 3,000 free trade and investment treaties across the globe that include ISDS clauses have led corporations to file lawsuits against governments totaling many billions of dollars. That's just the cases we know about. Many of these suits remain secret because these international tribunals in which they sue, those provisions are secret. They're not public. Those trials are secret. Details are secret. With climate negotiators meeting in Egypt, more than 350 organizations in more than 60 countries have issued a joint letter calling on governments to get rid of the investor-state dispute settlement system altogether. By the way, to Trump's credit, his administration had a very good uh, had a very good person uh, that was heading the trade administration in the federal government, and the person who headed it uh, was a careful person who was an opponent of the ISDS system. And so some of the renewals of our trade agreements during that time uh, greatly moderated the effects of the ISDS um, um, system and began to get rid of it. As the letter explains, the key risks posed by the ISDS system are: one, increased costs for governments to act on climate if corporations are able to claim exorbitant amounts of taxpayer money through an opaque lawsuit system of supranational courts. Now, as we know, in this country, we don't really have any taxpayer money spending, uh, any taxpayer money actually being spent by the government. However, uh, the corporations are able to claim exorbitant amounts of U.S. sovereign money created by the federal government, which is perhaps every bit as bad as draining taxpayer money would have been. And two, by regulatory chill, quote unquote, which may cause governments, out of fear of being sued, to delay or refrain from taking necessary climate action, a phenomenon seen in the past. Quote, communities on the front lines of the climate crisis are often at the heart of ISDS claims through struggles against destructive mining and other extractive projects. Quote, the statement points out, quote again, the evidence of years of damage to the environment, land health, and self-determination of peoples all around the world is stark, and the renewed urgency of the climate imperative is beyond doubt, unquote. The statement notes that a significant number of governments have already rejected the ISDS system. Countries such as South Africa, India, New Zealand, also Bolivia, Tanzania, Canada, and the US have all taken steps towards getting rid of ISDS. Canada and the United States eliminated investor state provisions between each other in the USMCA agreement, that is the United States, Mexico, Canada agreement, while that NAFTA replacement deal, done in the Trump administration, of course, sorry, scroll down a bit too fast. While that NAFTA replacement deal left key elements of the system intact with Mexico. My only comment here about that is, what's wrong with Mexico? Is Mexico chopped liver? The civil society statement urges governments to stop negotiating, signing, ratifying, or joining agreements which include ISDS clauses, such as the Energy Charter Treaty or the euphemistically titled Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership, better known as TPT. So Mexico is a party to TPT. We are not, by the way, because it never passed here, which can actually be used by Canada to allow its mining companies to file claims against Mexico. There are plenty of alternatives to this anti-democratic system. Governments could resolve investment issues between themselves through state-to-state dispute settlement rather than private corporations bringing cases against governments in supranational tribunals. An alternative system could also include investment risk insurance, international cooperation to strengthen national legal systems, and regional and international human rights mechanisms. But will the recent withdrawal of some European countries from the Energy Charter be a turning point? These actions clearly demonstrate how the EU strategy as the main promoter of that treaty has backfired, leading to its own member countries being sued for billions of dollars over CO2 emission control policies. A report by Lucia Barcina of the Transnational Institute documents how Spain stands at the list of countries facing the most suits with, as of October 2021, with 50 claims. But while Spain and some other European countries decided the ECT did not meet their required environmental standards, the EU is aiming to impose these exact same standards and other agreements, for instance, through the modernization of its free trade agreements with Mexico and Chile. So we're saying rich countries move away from investor-state dispute settlement mechanisms while intending to keep imposing this system on developing countries. And many developing country governments seem willing to allow themselves to be dragged along. Indeed, several countries in Asia, Africa, and even Latin America are waiting to join the ECT and other free trade agreements. For example, Guatemala, Panama, Colombia, and Chile are queuing up. Well, maybe they won't join those free trade agreements, if they look at what is being done by the BRICS. Maybe, just maybe, they ought to be looking at concluding trade agreements with the BRICS, which undoubtedly will not have any ISDS clauses in their trade agreements. We can hope that the progressive governments of Gustavo Petro in Colombia and Gabriel Boric in Chile will both distance themselves from this system. But it is disconcerting to see Boric already supporting the ratification of the TPP in Chile. And the AMLO government in Mexico is also upholding its support for free trade and investment protection treaties. The neoliberal investor-state system is a threat to the future of democracy and the future of the planet. It must end. Of course, I entirely agree with that. And you will see the agreement now come out in this excerpt from my book, Declarations of Dependence, Trade Tyranny, Sovereignty, and Democracy. The Kindle edition, by the way, the Kindle edition is the only edition. But anyway, let me pull up that excerpt from the book, which sells at Amazon. The electronic versions, that's the only version, Kindle version, sells for $9.99. Fairly reasonable compared to other MMT-based books. Okay. I had to pull this up as an application, so it's a little different. The excerpt starts with, this is particularly concerned with the undermining of governmental sovereignty in nations. This subsection is entitled Preserving the Range of Choice the Treasury Department Now Has to Fund Congressional Deficit Spending Appropriations. Right now, Treasury funds deficit spending overwhelmingly by issuing debt subject to the limit. However, it has a range, of other options. Hang on a second. Let me expand the size of the type in this one to 150%. That should be even better. Let me do it even more so you can see it better. Let's see how 175% does. Preserving the range of choice, the Treasury Department now has to fund Congressional Deficit Spending Association appropriations. Right now, Treasury funds deficit spending overwhelmingly by issuing debt subject to the limit. However, it has a range of other options for accomplishing this, useful in overcoming debt ceiling crisis created by an uncooperative House of Congress, or for the purpose of ceasing to issue debt at all in funding budget deficits. The TPP could infringe on the authority of the Treasury to use these methods, because it could, depending on the rulings of the ISDS tribunals, potentially prevent the Treasury from replacing the practice of issuing Treasury debt with other funding methods, since the alternative methods may impact profits of multinational corporations. In combination with a debt ceiling crisis, such rulings could prevent the Treasury from spending mandated congressional appropriations, forcing a constitutional crisis in which the president might have to invoke the 14th Amendment and rely on the Supreme Court to rule the debt ceiling legislation is unconstitutional. This is just one more way in which the TPP could infringe on the sovereignty of the federal government. Next, preserving the flexibility of the regulatory authority of the U.S. government over U.S. banks and the Federal Reserve System. A concrete example of the kinds of claims that would impact government flexibility and regulatory authority under agreements that have ISDS provisions come from a recent incident involving the Finance Minister of Canada, Joe Oliver. He erroneously claims that the Volcker rule implemented as part of the Dodd-Frank Wall Street Reform and Consumer Protection Act of 2010 violates the North American Free Trade Agreement signed into law on December 8th, 1993. Now, that agreement is no longer in effect because it was replaced by the United States, Mexico, Canada agreement of, I guess that was concluded in 2018, if I recall correctly. But this example still stands as an illustration. Oliver says that the Volcker rule prohibits U.S. banks from trading AAA rated Canadian government debt, thereby violating free trade under NAFTA. The United States has denied any such violation. I think the U.S. government has the better of this one, and it's interesting to consider why this is true, but it should be noted that Oliver would have a case here if the facts were not as I'm about to describe. According to our fundamental legal document, the Constitution of the United States, NAFTA isn't a treaty concluded by the United States with Canada, and Mexico. By the way, this argument applies to the U.S. MCA as well. Instead, I say, it is what is known as a Congressional Executive Agreement, a CEA. The difference between such an agreement and a treaty is that a CEA requires presidential approval and a plurality of votes in both houses of Congress legislating the agreement, while a treaty requires presidential submission of a negotiated agreement to the Senate for ratification by two-thirds of that body. Another difference is that a treaty takes precedence over mere laws. It is subordinate only to the provisions of the Constitution itself. In contrast, congressional executive agreements have no explicit status in the Constitution and amount to no more than new legislation passing the Congress and signed by the President, superseding previous laws when in conflict with them and being superseded by laws conflicting with them that are passed after the CEA was. So, in other words, the NAFTA CEA was superseded by the USMCA agreement. That is legally what happened. So legislation by Congress can supersede previous CEAs. Well, of course, the president has to be involved as well. Since the Dodd-Frank Act, with its Volcker Rule, was passed long after NAFTA was, it follows that where it conflicts with NAFTA, it does not violate the earlier act, but actually repeals that aspect of it, mandating free trade in Canadian debt instruments in a manner completely consistent with the U.S. Constitution. Further, if a multinational financial corporation were to take this case to an investor-state dispute settlement ISDS tribunal and win the case, then the U.S. government would be well within its rights to sue in U.S. courts, claiming that NAFTA cannot be applied to the Volcker Rule, since the law authorizing that rule repealed an aspect of NAFTA in a manner that was completely legal under the U.S. Constitution, and since NAFTA is not a treaty whose provisions have authority over later laws of the land that repeal some or part of NAFTA's provisions. Those following my reasoning closely may recognize that the general pattern of argument advanced here would be applicable to any quote-unquote free trade agreement that was negotiated by the United States and its partners as a congressional executive agreement, including the Trans-Pacific Partnership and other agreements being negotiated right now. That means that any one of them could have any or all aspects of, quote, free trade, unquote, under a congressional executive agreement repealed by a new law passed after the trade agreements. Our partners may not appreciate the United States withdrawing from trade agreements in this way, but provided this happens and provided our partners do object, then I think the remedy is for them and future administrations to make future trade agreements by using the treaty-making provisions of the constitutions rather than attempting to escape from treaty requirements by concluding congressional executive agreements. So all that would have to be done to repeal TPP and any other future trade agreements some idiot decides to approve, some idiot president, is to pass a new law constraining free trade that requiring that such disputes be adjudicated in the judicial systems of the signatory nations, stating that the U.S. would not recognize any decisions made by international ISDS tribunals established under the authority of the TPP. This can be done as soon as we have a new Congress where a majority of both houses are committed to repeal, along with the president who has made the same commitment and is willing to carry it out. In case the worst happens and TPP is passed by the Congress, and I said earlier, it was never passed by the Congress, we can do something about it, but I have to emphasize, Obama wanted it, and he got the Democrats in the House and Senate to pass the TPA, Trade Promotion Authority, which gave authority to the president, which lasted past 2015, and Trump had the same trade promotion authority. He did not use it in that way because he didn't like the TPP. So he didn't use it in that way. But we were lucky because he might have used it in that way. But the point is, what Obama got was authority to conclude an agreement, a trade agreement, and constrain the Congress from amending the trade agreement. In other words, trade promotion authority involved the president making an agreement, handing the agreement off to Congress, and all Congress could do with respect to that agreement was give it a yes or no. So they were constrained from amending it or trading it in any way, constrained from making it constitutional. That's the authority that was given to Obama by Nancy Pelosi, okay, and by the Senate. And the story of that is very, very interesting. It was a situation where Nancy Pelosi didn't want to come out in opposition to the TPP. And of course, Obama needed the TPA passed to try to pass the TPP. So she declared herself as neutral because 166 of the, well, it wasn't 166, it was roughly, I guess, 162. I have to discount the leadership team of Nancy Pelosi and herself, given the total. There were 188 members of Congress who were Democrats at that time. Okay. 160 of them, 5/6 of the caucus, were against the TPP and against granting the TPA to Obama. So Pelosi pretended she was neutral. The leadership that was going against the TPP inside the Democratic Party was given to Rosa DeLauro, who was very much against TPP, okay, and the TPA. Nancy Pelosi stepped out of it and adopted a position of neutrality, which she also commanded her whole leadership team to do. But in being absolutely neutral, she wasn't going along with the 5/6 of the Democratic caucus. She was going against 5/6 of her caucus. Normally, what happens is the caucus comes together and they vote on something, and the minority that's against that thing, for the sake of party unity, just goes along with the majority. But Nancy Pelosi adopted the position that she didn't want to force a vote on the 28 Democrats, or I should say it was the 22 Democrats because it doesn't include the four membership, the four who were members, okay, of her leadership team. So she was basically saying, I don't want to force the 24 members of the caucus who were in favor of the TPP and the TPA to vote against it. So I'm going to stand neutral, and I'm not going to throw my weight behind what the majority of the caucus wants. So basically, she had her leadership team come out eventually against the TPP, okay, and the TPA, but she allowed 28 of the most conservative Democrats to continue to go with the administration in support of the TPA, okay, and the TPP. And not only that, but most of the Republican caucus, except a very few people, was in favor of the TPP. It was the odd situation where the Republicans and 28 of the Democrats, and the Republicans had a majority in the House of Representatives at that time. Okay, so they voted with 28 of the Democrats to pass the Trade Promotion Authority and give Obama the authority to do this business of concluding an agreement and passing it on to the Congress for a yes or no vote. And Pelosi facilitated that. And then, to give the right impression to people, she ended up making a last minute speech in favor of the position taken by most of the Democratic caucus, and she voted against the TPA herself and had her leadership team vote against the TPA. That's what she did. Devious Nancy. Devious Nancy. Okay, in case the worst happens and TPP is passed by the Congress, we can do something about it by seeing to it that all those who supported it in both parties are defeated in 2016, and that no presidential candidate in 2016 who dares to support the TPP is elected, making it very likely that the new Congress and new president are committed to repeal. So let us join together to defeat the TPP before it passes, but in addition, let us resolve that whatever happens in the House or the Senate, we will not accept the passage of an act that threatens U.S. sovereignty on a daily basis, and that instead we will mobilize against the TPP, make it a 2016 elected issue, and make our elected representatives who defect and vote for it sorry they ever heard of the TPP and its ISDS tribunals. So that was what I proposed at that time. I have to go on to a few others, to a few other things that we could get into the trouble. We could have gotten into trouble with if we had passed, the TPP. Okay, next is preventing the Federal Reserve from using negative interest rate policies if it chooses to do so. I should note here, by the way, that Hillary Clinton favored the TPP at the start of our 2016 run. But fairly late in the game, she realized she had to declare against the TPP, and she did. But she declared too little and too late to change the situation in the Midwest, where those states were going for Trump because of Hillary's continued support of the TPP, and NAFTA. She was too associated with it to declare herself as opposed to it and have anybody believe it. And it was one reason why she lost the 2016 election to Trump. Go on. Anyway, going on. Preventing the Federal Reserve from using negative interest rate policies if it chooses to do so. ISDS tribunals could cause this problem in response to an ISDS suit, citing expectations of lost profits arising from negative interest rates on Treasury securities. The Fed has never used that tool of monetary policy in the past, but that doesn't mean it won't want to in the future. If the TPP is passed, however, then its freedom of action is compromised by providing ISDS tribunals with the authority to award lost profits to corporations that might lose money if the Fed made this policy move. In effect, the Fed would need an implicit buyer leave from the corporations and the ISDS panels to pursue such a policy. In fact, this point may easily be generalized. Every action of the central banks in every nation costs some corporation money and creates gains for other corporations. Of course, the corporations who gain will just accept their good luck, while among the corporations that lose, some will go to the ISDS tribunals because under the TPP they can, forcing the TPP signatory nations to bail out insolvent banks through ISDS settlements. The U.S. and other nations now have the choice of bailing out insolvent banks or allowing them to fail. But there is at least one case where an investor in a bank has been awarded damages from the Czech Republic by an ISDS panel because it's lost an investment in a bank that was failing, was declared insolvent, and then was taken over by a sovereign government signator to a free trade deal, namely the Czech Republic. So we know that ISDS tribunals can decide that way and restrict the policy space of sovereign governments to do anything but bail out multinational corporate investors and failed banks. How do we suppose the American public, including, of course, Tea Party activists, will react to such an infringement on American national sovereignty? If the next time, sorry, if the next time there's a great financial crisis, the president or the Fed says that they can't refuse to bail out the big banks because multinational investors in them are likely to win a massive court case against the U.S. if they do let those banks fail and then take them over. Ah, the next problem, turning over the legislative power of the federal government to the ISDS panels and the multinational corporations buying their loyalty. Of course, the legislative power turned over to the ISDS tribunals isn't the positive power to pass laws, but is the power to paralyze by legislative action by future Congresses that might reduce corporate, quote, expectations of profits, unquote. And it is also the power to prevent Congress from even considering a whole range of solutions to the many serious problems of the United States that would work, but that Congress sees as ruled out by past or likely ISDS tribunal decisions. Much of the power to legislate uh, lies in the power to block um, 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 legislation and to direct legislation away from certain alternatives. It is these powers that the TPP would be able to impose in undermining the sovereignty of national governments signing the TPP, including the U.S. government. Since the TPP provides these negative legislative powers to the ISDS tribunals, which would direct and constrain the positive legislative powers of national congresses and legislatures, the ISDS tribunals fuse legislative and judicial functions, breaching the separation of powers guaranteed by the U.S. and other constitutions. Also, this fusion is unconstrained because it is legislative authority that could be applied in almost any area government decides to legislate about. Since multinational corporations or multinational corporate investors may be involved in and may find that their, quote, expectations of profits, unquote, are impacted by any new legislation in any area. Indeed, one has to ask the important question of whether, under the TPP and the standard of impacting expectations of profits of multinationals, there is operationally any area of government activity in which new legislation by a local, state, or national government would not impact the expectations of any number of corporations, some favorably and others unfavorably. If not, then isn't it true that governments can expect to have to cope with ISDS actions in connection with any legislation they pass and any rule change they make? And isn't it also true that the ISDS provisions in the TPP are, in fact, a grant of exclusive authority to profit making multinational corporations in comparison to all other types of social institutions to review and veto legislation by democratically elected Congresses and legislative bodies countering popular sovereignty with multinational corporate sovereignty? And if it is, then are the possible benefits of the TPP, even if they are as claimed by its proponents, really worth the price of elevating multinationals above the people and their representatives? So that was my argument, saying that these international trade agreements that have the ISDS clauses in them undermined the national sovereignty of the United States. Hope you find that argument convincing. That comes directly from declarations of dependence. There's much more in that book. And if you're curious, perhaps you'd like to buy it. It's very reasonable from Amazon. And Kay says these treaties seem to be all BS, but unfortunately they're considered the law of the land. Okay, at this point, they may all be BS. That might well be true, but it is still the case that these BS treaties are governing us all. And by the way, there were awards that went to Canada under the NAFTA treaty. Specifically, Canada objected to country of origin labeling on goods, which the United States was doing with Canadian products. We were labeling it as, made in Canada, coming from Canada. We had done this forever, for all time. Canada decided to object to this. And so the labeling of country of origin on goods coming from Canada was ended. And we didn't have the right to know where Canadian stuff was coming from when we went shopping at the stores, because of a finding of one of these international tribunals. And we had to comply, because if we hadn't complied, then there would have been very heavy penalties placed on the U.S. So that was the case in point. The book contains many cases in point where many decisions were rendered by these international tribunals, costing national governments considerable amounts of money. So that's it for this particular topic. I hope you enjoyed this. I have to remind you, of course, that, I have my Patreon account, patreon.com/Joe_Firestone, and also my Buy Me a Coffee account at buymeacoffee.com/Joe.Firestone. And you can contribute if you're so moved, at either of these destinations. For now, I'm going to say good night. There is another show, though, coming up, at 10 p.m. I have 10 minutes to get set up for that particular show. What we're going to talk about, in that particular show is we're going to talk about debt ceiling crises again, because something ridiculous has just happened concerning the debt ceiling crisis, which we are starting to approach. And I know you'll be very interested in hearing about that, because it speaks to the question of, let me move this a little bit, because it speaks to the question of the fecklessness of the Democratic Party. and I'm sure you'll be interested in hearing about that. So I'll say good night for now, and hopefully I'll see you in 9 minutes, okay, along with a lot of other people who, for some reason, didn't find this topic to be interesting. I've always found the ISDS stuff to be enormously interesting.